The neon sign of her little shop blinked in tired amber as Maya slid the last chair up onto the counter and wiped a smear of espresso from the wood. The air smelled of old paper and warm sugar, the turntable in the corner still humming a fragment of a song that had played all afternoon. Outside, rain stitched the city into streaks of light. A ferry horn sighed from the harbor like a tired animal. Her hands smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner, and there was a thin ache under her ribs that felt less like fatigue and more like the weight of a promise she had made years ago. It was nearly midnight in the South Harbor District, a part of the city that kept its secrets close and its lights low. Maya flipped the lock, checked the register, said goodnight to Tomas, who lived above and had been dozing with a book on his chest, and reached for the lamp when a soft knock came from the glass. 3 careful taps that did not sound like a customer, not at that hour. She paused, the lamp in one hand and the key in the other, listening to the city breath around the little storefront. A man stood under the streetlight, shoulders wrapped in a coat that had seen better winters. He smelled faintly of tobacco and oil, like an engine room on a foggy morning. He was not someone from this block. He moved with a control that made the shadows lean in, and when he lifted his face, the light caught an old scar at his temple. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even and had the smooth force of someone used to asking for things and having them given. "One," he said, "please." Maya had closed the lights. She had every reason to say no. The chipped mug she kept behind the counter was a relic of her sister Anna, a small white thing with a hairline crack down the side. When the man watched her with a patience that felt like intent, her fingers trembled as if the mug itself was pulsing with expectation. "We're closed," she said. "It is late." "I know," he answered. "Just a cup. I will not take more." "I have to lock up," she said, the words practical and small. "It will take a minute," he said. He offered no name. The street light caught a ring on his hand and a tiny fleck of gold that could have been a family crest or a coin. She opened the door a crack. The bell made a soft sound like a question. In that sliver of light, she smelled rain and old metal and something like benger that smelled almost like cologne. She served the coffee and, without meaning to, told him her name. He did not offer his. He watched her stir sugar as if watching a map unfold. When he left, he pressed a folded note into her palm, weightless as a whisper. On the walk home, she did not read it. That note would later prove to be an invitation, an accusation, and the first hinge on which the rest of her life would turn. She did not know then, standing in her doorway as the harbor fog swallowed the street, that letting him in was the same as leaving the door unlocked for the storm that would follow. The first night after that knock, the barista's rhythm changed. Small things shifted, like the way the light fell on the counter or the ordering of the sugar jars. Maya thought about the man in the coat in the spaces between making espresso and counting cash. His silhouette returned in the reflections of shop windows and in the way customers cleared their throats when his name passed through the rumor mill at the docks. She saw him twice more in the days that followed. Once at dawn, leaving the harbor office building with a folder under his arm, and once in a photograph in the business section of the local paper that showed him at a ribbon cutting, expensive shoes on a red carpet, and a stern set to his jaw. The headline called him a developer. A comment thread called him the boss. A neighbor, Louisa from the flower shop next door, said the name out loud one afternoon over bags of compost, and looked at Maya with the kind of curiosity that pretends not to judge. "They say he keeps things tidy," Louisa said, hands deep in soil, "but clean hands can hide a lot." Marta, who ran the corner bodega, told stories that were half gossip and half warning. Officer Ramirez, who came in for a coffee sometimes, offered a less friendly nod and a question about permits and property lines. Maya found her days punctuated by these small reckonings, the public and private names of the man folding together like pages in a book. She told herself she did not belong to that world, that the shop was a shelter from those currents, but the truth was that the shop had always been more than a place to sell coffee. It was a ledger of promises. It was where she kept a vow she had made to her younger sister Anna to build something that would last. And every time she passed the note in her pocket, brittle from being folded twice, the weight of what she had done and what she might have invited did not feel light. "Are you going to tell me his name?" Tomas asked one morning as he stacked late returns on the shelf. He had the slow patience of someone who reads everything twice. "You already saw him in the paper." "He did not give me a name," Maya said. "You saw him at the ribbon cutting. You know people." Tomas touched the photograph on the counter, a smear of ink and glossy smiles. "Vincenzo Moretti," he read. "They say he bought the pier." "Moretti," Maya repeated, as if testing the syllables in her mouth. The word came with a history, a shape that did not fit into their small, orderly lives. "Everyone in the harbor knows that surname," said Louisa when she tied a bouquet for a customer. "Either your family knew him, or you knew to keep your doors bolted." "We have a business to run," Maya said. "We cannot live off fear." "But you cannot pretend you are invisible either," Marta said, sliding a pack of cigarettes across the counter with a raised eyebrow. The exchanges grew into a flow of small confessions and guarded opinions. In the mornings, the rain smelled fresher, and the record player was wound to a warm scratch. In the afternoons, the rumor of his name did what rumors always do. It rearranged loyalties and opened old ledgers. One evening, when the shop had emptied and the light had gone soft, the bell above the door chimed, and he was there again, the coat heavy with rain. "You made coffee for me the other night," he said. "You have a good touch." She folded her hands around the chipped mug, feeling the heat transfer to her skin, the little comfort of an object that belonged to a memory. "You did not give your name," she said. He considered that a moment and then smiled in a way that did not reach his scar. "Names," he said, "are small, but I will give you something else." He reached into his pocket and placed a card on the counter. It had a logo, a phone number, and a line that implied power without needing to say it. "If you ever need help," he said, "call." There were 10 short exchanges between them that night, light and edged with things unsaid. His voice softened when he spoke of the neighborhood, as if he had plans for it, as if his intentions could be gentle. He offered small reassurances, words that sounded like promises, and then left with a nod that carried a note of ownership. Maya watched him go, and the bell's little song felt like a verdict. The city made room for him, and for the first time in a while, she wondered how wide the door really was. If you felt the same sudden tightness when she opened the door, you are not alone. Share in the comments, have you ever let someone into your life even though a part of you knew better? Start your reply with "I" or "when" and tell one sentence about what happened. Your story can help others. I read every comment and sometimes I bring them into future episodes. Now keep listening. The morning after his last visit, the harbor paper ran a column about city investment and photos of shovels in the soil. Someone had even called the shop, asking if Maya would host a meeting, as if the little counter could a stage for bigger plans. The rumor did not sleep. It grew teeth. The news traveled faster than the ferry lines. A local blog ran a piece about new development plans near the docks and used a photograph of Vincenzo Moretti smiling as a ribbon was cut. The comments section, as always, offered both hope and suspicion. "Finally," wrote one user, "the harbor will get what it needs." "Watch your corners," wrote another, responding with a string of accusations rooted in old tales the older fishermen liked to tell at the bar. When a television crew appeared one afternoon to talk to boat owners about zoning changes, the camera lingered for a moment on Maya's window, on the chipped mug at the counter, and then moved on to interviews that painted Vincenzo as a visionary. That same evening, a young man in a suit and sunglasses came into the shop and bought a paper, his body language flat and watchful. "He is everywhere," said Officer Ramirez when he stopped by for a takeout coffee, tapping his pen on a receipt as if punctuation could hold the narrative steady. "Keep records," he said with a professional nod, as if a notebook could be armor. Maria from the laundromat brought over clean sheets and a whisper. "He is building. He is buying." The name became a presence in the neighborhood, not merely a rumor, but an actor. It drew eyes, it reshaped conversations, and it laid claim to futures. For customers who had always loved Maya for the way she remembered their orders, there was a new curiosity coloring their loyalty. She heard the word boss, heard it phrased with fear and with admiration, and each time it touched her ears, it altered how the street looked. The shop, which had been a haven against the city's churn, suddenly carried a new possibility and a new danger. To the city, Vincenzo was a diagram of change. To Maya, he was an unresolved sentence leaning on a countertop. The morning paper referred to him as a developer, the blog called him a boss, and a hand-painted flyer tacked to the lamppost called him a risk. Names rearranged the neighborhood like a deck of cards. Maya's childhood came back to her in sections, not as one clean film, but as glints of light. She was the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, raised in a small apartment above a garage where oil stains annotated her first drawings. Her mother taught her to read before she could tie her shoes, setting storybooks on her lap like stepping stones. And her father showed her how to strip a carburetor, how to coax life back into tired machines. The shop was both of those heritages. It was stories and grease, care and craft. In school, she loved the parts of math that felt like recipes, the way ratios could make dough rise or payments balance. At 19, she left to study literature in a city 2 hours from the harbor, but the call of home was a constant undercurrent. A tragedy folded their family inward when a fire took her parents' apartment the year she was 26. They lost the roof and the spare tools and the old piano, and they lost time that would never be repaid. Maya returned to the harbor with soot on her sleeves and a promise in her mouth. She took a loan, scraped together savings, and fixed the storefront on Marlowe Street into a place where stories could be traded with coffee. Her sister Anna was the reason she kept the chipped mug. Anna had a laugh that could rearrange weather, and when the smoke finally cleared, Anna said 2 things to Maya: "We rebuild and keep the coffee hot." Maya had taken that as law. She did not open the shop only to sell drinks. She opened it to keep a promise that a small business could be a town anchor. The years taught her accounting and patience, taught her how to argue with suppliers and how to calm customers who cried. She learned to read the city in small gestures, in which merchants nervously rearranged displays when a new name arrived in the paper. Loss had hardwired her to keep one eye on the ledger and the other on the street. The shop was her ledger of love. When Vincenzo's note had arrived folded in her palm, it struck a chord, not because of his authority, but because it suggested that someone from a place that stepped on smaller promises may now be stepping into hers. She had not sought power. She had only sought the quiet dignity of a day that paid its rent and kept her sister safe. That backstory made her choices more than personality. It made them necessity. In the weeks that followed, Maya and Vincenzo's conversations deepened with a slow insistence. The exchanges at the counter stretched longer, 8 to 10 turns at a time, intimate and edged with practicalities. "You have a stubbornness," he observed one evening as the shop glowed orange and the rain drummed patterns on the window. "I have investments," he said another time, "and I respect the small things." "Respect is not the same as possession," she told him, stirring sugar without looking up. "I know," he answered, "but people mistake ownership for care sometimes." The dialogue turned from small talk to something like negotiation. "Why me?" she asked once, folding her hands on the chipped mug. "You run a pocket of the city that is honest," he said. "Honesty attracts loyalty. Loyalty is useful." "Useful in whose hands?" "In mine," he said. There were moments of tenderness, where his voice softened when he asked about Anna or about the mural that Maya had painted on the shop's north wall. "Your mural," he said, touching the edge of a photograph on the counter. "It is stubborn and beautiful." "It was painted by the neighborhood," Maya replied. "We keep things together." "Then keep them," he said simply. The conversations were often practical, sometimes flirtatious, occasionally suspicious, and always heavy with unspoken stakes. Each exchange layered more complexity on the relationship. His men, a quiet group of volunteers who appeared at odd hours to fix a loose sign or to paint a wall in a way that looked like charity, began to circulate in the streets. Marco the electrician fixed the breaker at no charge one afternoon and later told Maya with a shrug that the boss liked things done exactly. "He pays in ways that make you forget the price," Marco said. There was an outward generosity that came with an inner ledger. People accepted it differently. Some felt gratitude, others felt the old cold that warns a neighborhood when the balance of power shifts. Those conversations at the counter pivoted the neighborhood's access. They were the quiet mechanics that made the larger drama possible. Tensions grew obvious in slanting ways. One night, witnesses on the pier said a black SUV idled near the docks and two men in plainclothes took photographs of the mural, zooming in on a figure's face. Someone left a card in Maya's mailbox that read, "Keep out of other people's plans," in blunt handwriting. Rumors circulated, and the local reporter, Jonah, a wiry man who liked the smell of paper and the taste of scandal, came by asking questions about property lines and promises. "Are you planning to sell?" he asked, pen poised. "No," Maya said. "Then why do you tolerate someone whose money shifts the tide?" Jonah's questions were not only professional. There was a hunger in them that matched the city. One night, as Maya locked the shop, a car pulled up and a young woman stumbled out, frightened and crying. "They took my brother's tools," she said, voice raw. "He works at the pier. They said if I talk to the wrong people, there will be consequences." The city had always been a place where those consequences could be carried like weather. Maya did what she could. She brewed tea, wrapped a scarf around the woman's shoulders, and called Officer Ramirez. The exchanges in the shop now included urgent whispers and the clacky presence of worry. There were at least 3 moments that made breath catch and hands go numb. The first was when a threatening note arrived with a smear of grease and an unsigned warning. The second was when someone tried to force the back door a week later and left a scratch across the wood so deep it showed white. The third was when Anna, who had been working late, called Maya in a voice that was all tremor and static, and then went silent for 5 long minutes before returning to calm. Each of those moments lasted like a held note, demanding answers that did not come easily. They were, in total, the first true fractures in the trust that might have been forming. Between the woman behind the counter and the man with the scar. The first real breach happened on a humid evening when the city smelled like diesel and warm trash. Maya was closing when 2 men in plain jackets appeared in the doorway. One had a face like a bad trade, the other kept his jaw tight. They did not speak as much as slide into the room, like someone who thought they owned the right to be there. "We need to ask about the boss," the taller one said, voice flat. "You have been seen with him." Maya felt the chipped mug press like a small island against the heat of the counter. "I serve everyone," she said. "You cannot keep a ledger of who comes in." The taller man leaned in, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey. "Tell him to stop asking questions," he said. "Tell him to hold back." A dozen short exchanges followed as Maya tried to deflect, to keep the conversation practical, to make the men remember that they were in the wrong place for threats. "We are shutting you down," the shorter man said eventually, as if the idea of shutting down a small shop could be an answer. "You cannot be useful if you make noise." They left as quietly as they had come, the bell sounding small and private. After they left, the shop seemed colder. That night, Maya sat at the counter and wrote down names of people she trusted, underlining them like a lifeline. There was a particular cadence to that tension, a slow build that forced choices rather than providing them. This scene contained an expansion of threat, 8 tight exchanges that blurred courtesy and intimidation. The seizure happened a week later, and it was sudden in the way storms sometimes are, without long warning and with a force that rearranged everything. Maya had been on her way to lock the back when someone grabbed her from behind and a cloth pressed to her face. There was a cleanness to the method, a cold efficiency, as if whoever planned it had learned to remove noise from a room by practice. Her thoughts peeled like film in the dark. She tried to move, but found her wrist fastened, a knot that had been practiced many times before. They dragged her into a van that smelled the way vans often do, like wet rubber and old coffee. In the back, a single light hung like a small moon, and her head swam with images of the shop, the chipped mug, the mural. They did not talk much. Orders were given in clipped phrases, and the men who took her worked with the quiet of those who do not look at their hands when they are dirty. The 3 paragraphs of her memory of the kidnapping are a slow reel of tactile details: the scrape of a seatbelt, the hiss of the van's heater, the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. Outside, the city wore a different face of night, one that belonged to people who kept accounts in the margins. The entire episode lasted like a held breath and then a fall. That was the thing about being taken. Time becomes a spool, and you are only one thread. The fear was not only for herself. It was for the ledger she managed, the promises she had kept, the sister who leaned on her strength. The technical residue of a kidnapping is messy. Fingerprints on a van seat, a partial shoe print in mud, a fiber from a jacket. The police would later catalog these traces with an even hand, dusting a seat with a powder, photographing the small evidence, cross-referencing CCTV footage. Those procedures, camera checks and analyzations of fibers and prints, map onto a search like a skeleton. They give shape to chaos. The team that came for her had left an imprint across the harbor, and the forensic work that followed filled reports and made the city read as if it could be recoded into a sequence of solvable facts. Those steps were methodical and explained how small, overlooked things turned into leads. It was a cold comfort. He found her at the edge of the pier, hands tied, voice raw from shouting before someone finally chose to hear. He arrived not with a crowd, but with a small, controlled unit of men, who moved like a single organism, as if his directions were the only language they spoke. The rescue was precise and swift. There were at least 10 shorter exchanges between Vincenzo and those around him as they organized transport and medical checks, the anti-hero syntax efficient, his orders concise. "Get her into the van," he said. "Keep watch." The men moved like cranes, lifting something fragile and valuable. Maya watched him with a clarity that comes when the body is alive and the mind is too tense to narrate. When he knelt and cut the rope, he looked at her with an intensity that did not soften into apology. "I am not done with you," he whispered, the words both a claim and a promise. The rescue put him squarely into the role of protector, an action that stitched both gratitude and suspicion into Maya's chest. She would later have to reconcile the way his hands moved with the way his men had moved to take her. Rescue and threat had folded into the same narrative. Not long after the rescue, the shop burned. It was not the kind of blaze that warms or clears. It came at dusk when the light slanted low and the street emptied into shadows. Maya had just returned from a hospital with paper towels stained at the edges from leaning in to kiss Anna's forehead. A smell hit her the instant she stepped off the curb, something wrong in the air. The flames took the room that had been organized by stories. Fire licked the ceiling, and black smoke wrapped itself around table legs and books. The mural became a silhouette against heat. People ran, some banging on neighboring doors, some dialing numbers with hands that shook. The firefighters arrived with a precise choreography. Hoses unfurled, axes bit into wood. A ladder stood against the sky like a hopeful line. The blaze was both spectacle and loss. Maya felt the heat strike bone and memory at once. A neighbor, Carlos from the mechanic shop, hauled a stack of soaked papers from the back and handed them to her as if a life could be saved in a handful of pages. "We will rebuild," he said, eyes red from smoke. The scene lasted in the community like a wound and a call to arms. The smell of burnt sugar and coffee drifted for days. Among the rubble, they found a charred piece of the chipped mug, a blackened crescent that made her lungs tighten. The fire was both a symbolic excision and a material loss. It removed the ledger and left a bill of slats and nails in its place. That night, Vincenzo stood with the crowd, soot on his coat, and said nothing to the press. He handed Maya a folded envelope and, in front of witnesses, promised funds to help rebuild. There were arguments about whether to take his money. There were at least 8 exchanges among neighbors in the street about the implications of accepting help from someone who had men who could take and men who could also give. Some said no. Some said the shop was more than a ledger of virtue. In those debates, the neighborhood line rearranged. Accepting his help might mean survival. Refusing could mean pride. The choice felt like a moral ledger in miniature. The days of Reconstruction turned the shop into a pubic theater. The local TV came to film volunteers hauling wood and painting new frames. Louisa brought chrysanthemums and a ladder. Marco the electrician rewired lights with careful precision and joked about wiring that would never betray them. Officer Ramirez set up a small meeting where people could speak about safety. Vincenzo's men painted a new sign in 2 afternoons, efficient hands moving as if they had practiced charity as a ritual. People argued about whether this was liberation or colonization of the block. There were public confrontations with a developer's attorney and with men who claimed to be representatives of other investors. Tensions spread outward as old alliances shifted under the pressure of decisions. One night, a rival group sent graffiti across the mural, black spray making a jagged insult that read like a pronouncement. The war that followed was mostly cold. It played out in letters, in meetings, in a push by local council to rezone the pier. Vincenzo called together a meeting in the back room of the shop that included community leaders and men in suits who smelled expensive. The exchange there was heavy, legal arguments and softer pleas crossing the pier. Air with equal measure. "We can rebuild on our terms," Maya insisted when she had the floor, "but we will not sign away the soul of the block." Vincenzo listened and then spoke about investment as if it were a language of care. "You can have stabilization or you can have ruin," he told them, his voice measured. "I can hold both." That phrase would be dissected later in prints and in gossip. There were at least 12 conversations that grew into a web of decisions. Losses arrived in small packets. A corner store closed. A muralist left town. But some neighbors stayed, like Luisa and Tomas and Carlos. The shop reopened under a tarp and then under glass, and then finally with new shelves that carried the faint smell of paint and the lived memory of smoke. The legal machinery that followed the fire and the kidnapping required methodical translations of emotion into procedure. Police files filled with statements that read like testimonies and like daily ledger entries. Forensics examined the point of ignition, testing for accelerants and tracing a heat pattern across the floor to assess origination. Arson investigators use a standard process: examine the scene for burn patterns, collect debris for laboratory analysis, and correlate evidence with witness accounts and surveillance footage. The legal steps involved obtaining restraining orders, presenting probable cause for search warrants, and negotiating with prosecutors who weighed evidence against community sentiment. Each technical explanation was a narrow bridge between what happened and how the law might respond. Those steps were clinical, a way of making chaos legible to institutions that move slowly. The investigations produced reports, and the reports produced hearings. Papers sat on desks like small mountains. As the neighborhood lurched through decisions, Maya and Vincenzo's relationship became something like a weather pattern that could not be predicted. He was often there, sometimes quietly helping to replace a window, other times insisting on buying supplies. He told stories in the way that people who have been both cruel and kind tell stories, with a voice that held both confession and command. Their dialogues lengthened into confessions and bargaining. "You will accept the money," he said one night. "I do not want you to be forced." "Who forced you to save me?" she asked. "The difference is that I can pay to put things right and others cannot," he said. "That is true," she said. And yet, money is not the only ledger. Their back and forth stretched into page-long conversations at times, where each sentence pulled a memory into the light. He shared a story about the spar at his temple, a trivial accident that had been preserved like a heraldic mark. He spoke of family duties and of power as inheritance. Maya told him about Anna and the chipped mug and the vow to keep the shop alive. These exchanges did what intimate dialogues do. They humanized both, and yet they never removed the fact of power between them. The climax came in a public hearing stretched into the evening, where lines were drawn like chalk in a schoolyard. Vincenzo appeared with a briefcase and with smiles that were designed to disarm. Opposite him, a collective of neighbors and small business owners brought testimonies and petitions. There were at least 10 energetic exchanges on the record. Each question met with a practiced answer, and each objection answered with legalese designed to be both precise and persuasive. Jonah, the reporter, covered the hearing live, tweeting phrases that would later be used in op-eds. During a recess, something happened small and bitter. Someone splashed a can of paint across the new sign, and a scuffle broke out on the sidewalk. The scuffle was a connective tissue between the local fight and a broader push for power. It resulted in a short, messy arrest and a cascade of rumors. People drew alliances quickly. Some accepted the narrative that Vincenzo had come as a savior. Others saw a man buying permission to alter the soul of the block. The resolution did not come wrapped neatly. It was messy and slow and required both legal compromise and personal concessions. Maya agreed to a partnership that allowed community oversight of new projects, a clause written into a contract that spelled out neighborhood committees and required public meetings. It was not the clear victory she had imagined when she fought the idea of selling. It was, instead, a ledger of compromises that cost her in public trust and in private rest. He, in turn, learned to let his hands be dirty in smaller ways that did not always match his larger habits. There was a public moment when he stood at the reopened shop and said words that made some in the crowd cry and others grit their teeth. "I do not expect to be loved," he said plainly in front of microphones and cameras. "I expect to be useful." The community accepted the partnership under oath. Some neighbors came to the reopening and sat together at the counter, their faces mapped by the stories they had lived through. The shop smelled of new wood and coffee and the faint memory of smoke. Maya had kept the chipped mug. In a private moment, after the crowd had thinned, Vincenzo placed his hand on the chipped mug, as if feeling a pulse. He had scars that matched the city, and she had a ledger heavy with choices. Love settled in strange places. It was not a rom-com. It was two people learning to accept that parts of each other would always be a challenge, and that some promises cost more than money. 1 month later, after the formal repairs and the first town council meeting that imposed the neighborhood oversight clause, life found a new rhythm. The shop reopened with a new sign, the paint dry and the letters proud. Luisa arranged a bouquet in the window, and Carlos ran a small donation for a shelf for displaced workers. Anna sat at the table with a stack of notebooks, her laughter a small bell that made the shelves feel less like memorials and more like accounts being settled. Vincenzo came less as an editor of fate and more as a man with sleeves rolled, buying a pastry and leaving quietly. Maya watched him sometimes with the same clearness as after the rescue, seeing both the capacity for protection and the shadow of past ledgers. The community meetings that had seemed like lines drawn across a map softened into monthly gatherings, where people argued and then agreed about paint colors and shipping schedules, and where to put the mural's final panel. The shop's mural included a small black crescent in its corner as a reminder of what had been saved and what had been lost. People who had left returned, tentatively, to help. The business did not become wealthy overnight, but it became stable. Small triumphs accumulated: a summer fair that raised funds, a local paper that ran a sympathetic piece focusing on the volunteers, a patron who bought a stack of gift cards for delivery drivers. In private, Maya and Vincenzo had conversations that were quieter than their earlier fights. He once said, "I do not require forgiveness," and she replied, "Forgiveness does not always fit the ledger either." Their intimacy was marked more by shared silences than declarations. The chipped mug lived on the highest shelf, a relic that had once been part of a threatened life and later a symbol of the neighborhood's endurance. 3 months later, the rumor machine began to whisper a different tune. A rival group trying to purchase the southern pier was thwarted, partly because the neighborhood oversight clause made the purchase impractical, and partly because local voices had learned to speak with a stronger tone. A small documentary aired that featured Maya and the shop as an example of grassroots resilience. Donations came from far corners of the city, and a fundraiser at the community hall collected money enough to repair part of the shop without depending entirely on Vincenzo. He watched the fundraiser with an admixture of pride and distance. He had been accepted by the block in a way he had not anticipated, and that unsettled him more than any scandal. Maya noticed a change in him. His manner softened around the people who fixed chairs and painted signs. He began to leave the shop with a small bag of books he had bought, not all of which he would read. The relationship settled into something like truce, and then, quietly, into companionship. There was no formal proposal in the way movies show it, but there was a public commitment. In a packed street after a weekend market, he handed her a small square of paper and asked if she would be part of a project to create a foundation that would protect small businesses in the harbor. She accepted the partnership as if taking on a new ledger, one of safeguarding rather than surrendering. The city kept ticking, and their lives folded into its rhythm. 6 months later, the shop was a testament. The mural was complete, its colors vivid against the once burned wall. Children played outside on a block that had learned to guard its own spaces. Maya taught a night class once a week on small business bookkeeping at the community center, and Anna had started an apprenticeship program to help other local youth learn barista skills and basic accounting. Vincenzo attended one of the classes once and asked a practical question about inventory turnover that surprised the room into laughter. There were photographs in a local magazine that showed him and Maya standing together with paint on their sleeves, both of them marked in their own ways by the last year. The scar at his temple and the hairline crack in the chipped mug were tokens of what they had endured and what they had chosen. The final months had been a study in how people survived power and how power could be coerced into making small things better. In front of the shop, under the same neon that had once flickered amber and lonely, Maya and Vincenzo shared a quiet moment. He did not pull out a ring. He did not need to. He offered a promise instead that was public and practical and unlikely to dazzle, but likely to hold. "I will help you protect this place," he said. "I will keep watch so that the city cannot take what you have built." She looked up at him and then at the chipped mug on the counter and accepted, not a submission, but a choice to make a different kind of ledger. The city hummed. The harbor fog rolled in and out like a breath. The years that followed were not free of cost. There were audits, there were protests, and there were nights when arguments flared about which side of the ledger weighed more. Some in the neighborhood never forgave the partnership. Others defended it fiercely, the way a community defends a bridge built across a rift. Maya learned that compromise is not a single act, but a long apprenticeship. She had to lose some illusions and gain a sturdier definition of power. The shop became a training ground for small decisions, and a place where the city's larger moves could be resisted in increments. Vincenzo became less of a myth and more of a complicated neighbor. He cut his hair after someone called him an old symbol in a comment thread and started showing up to meetings with lists. He kept some of his past habits, and she kept some of her frugality. But together, they learned how to translate influence into protection that did not erase voice. 1 year after the night she first left the lights on, there was a quiet celebration that felt like a ledger finally balanced for the moment. The community had painted a new mural panel that included a small, chipped mug and a hand holding it with care. The television aired a piece about the harbor renewal that included clips of volunteers and interviews that did not hide the complexity of the story. Miriam from the laundromat baked a pie. Thomas played a slow song on the turntable, and Anna danced without caring how anyone saw her. Vincenzo stood at the back of the room watching, and when Maya stepped outside, he took her hand in public for the first time. He did not whisper about ownership or about debts. He said, plainly and in front of witnesses, "I asked to be part of the work. I was not done with you the night I found you. I am still not done. I would like to be doing the work with you." The proposal was not a theatrical flourish. It was a request to share labor, risk, and vigil. She answered with a nod and a small laugh and a squeeze that was as much an agreement as any ring. The city would keep moving. The harbor would remain both promise and peril. But the shop, on that street, would keep serving coffee in a chipped mug for people who needed a place to feel counted. In the end, what remained was neither his money nor her stubbornness alone. It was the ledger they wrote together, a record filled with community meetings and rebuilt shelves and the small acts that stitch a neighborhood back together. The ship horns still called across the water. The neon still blinked, but steadier now. The mural told a story of smoke and paint and hands. The chipped mug sat in its usual place, and when Maya lifted it in the morning light, she felt the weight of all that had happened like a folded map she carried in her apron. The final line that stayed with people was not about rescue or ruin, but about the choice to remain. She had turned off the lights to close, and when the boss whispered that he was not done with her, she had answered in a way that kept the ledger open, not by surrendering, but by inviting someone to learn the balance.